They say a scream was heard in the dead of night, piercing the cold December air of 1887, echoing down the cobbled streets of Pittsburgh's elite district, but no one ever found the source. That scream marked the last moment Evangelene Vandermark was ever seen alive. The wife of Cornelius Vandermark, one of the wealthiest industrial magnates of the Gilded Age, Evangelene was not merely a society woman. She was the heiress to a powerful Boston family, educated, sharp, and quietly feared in the salons and parlors of the rich. Her disappearance was reported with somber headlines, then quickly forgotten, as if a hand had erased her from history. But beneath the surface of that disappearance was a horror story so vast, so meticulously orchestrated, that to speak of it now is to whisper against centuries of silence. There was no ransom, no sightings, and no suspects. Just an emerald gown left in the mansion's foyer, and whispers among the servants of strange noises behind locked doors. Cornelius told the public that his beloved wife had vanished without a trace, his grief displayed like a badge at every public event. But behind those grieving eyes lay a secret so dark that even mentioning it was a death sentence. You see, Evangelene had discovered something buried deep in the corridors of power, tied to industrial empires, blood-soaked wealth, and a circle of men who used murder as a tool of business. This was not merely a missing person case, this was the silencing of a threat. And the truth? It was hidden in the very walls of the Vandermark mansion, locked away for decades, waiting to be unearthed by accident, by fate, by decay. Now, more than a century later, the remnants of Evangelene's final days have come to light, and what they reveal is a conspiracy so massive, so deeply rooted in America's rise to power, that it redefines the cost of progress. This story isn't what for the faint of heart. It is the story of control, psychological, political, and personal, wielded by a cabal who manipulated reality itself. Evangelene dared to expose them, and she paid the ultimate price. Listen carefully, for this is dangerous knowledge, the kind that once heard changes a man forever. Welcome to the mystery they never wanted you to solve. The Vandermark mansion stood like a fortress of secrets atop a hill overlooking Pittsburgh's smoky skyline, a grotesque monument to steel and silence. By day, it was a marvel of architecture, its stone walls and stained glass windows drawing admiration from every socialite and businessman. But by night, the mansion pulsed with a darker energy, its halls echoing with whispers of deals made in blood, of laughter that masked terror, of footsteps that never seemed to stop. Evangelene had lived in that house for over a decade, and though she had once been blinded by love, by privilege, by illusions of safety, all of it shattered the moment she found the ledger. Hidden behind a false panel in Cornelius's private study, the ledger detailed payments, not just bribes but expenses, payments for accidents at rival mills, payouts for silencing witnesses, and worst of all, entries marked only with initials and dates. Evangelene knew what she had stumbled upon, and she knew she had only one chance to stop it. In the weeks before her disappearance, her demeanor changed. Friends noticed she stopped attending social functions. Servants whispered that she spent hours locked in her study, writing letters, organizing papers, and speaking in hushed tones with her brother Edmund, a disbarred attorney who had returned to Pittsburgh under mysterious circumstances. But no one imagined the storm that was about to break. On December 12, 1887, Evangelene disappeared. And in the silence that followed, Cornelius Vandermark's power grew even stronger. Her name was wiped from family records, her belongings quietly auctioned off, and her portrait removed from the mansion's gallery. But a few whispers remained, too quiet to be heard by the masses, too persistent to die. And one day those whispers became a roar, because hidden behind the library's oak paneling, sealed in darkness, was a room that would one day reveal the truth. A truth Evangelene had died to protect. This is not just a tale of murder. This is the anatomy of power, how it grows, how it hides, and how it destroys. Follow me deeper into the labyrinth. There is no turning back now. The hidden chamber was discovered by accident in 1921 during a renovation meant to convert the abandoned Vandermark mansion into a museum. A worker prying away a crumbling bookcase revealed a narrow passage leading to a sealed room, undisturbed for more than 3 decades. What they found inside changed everything. Dust covered every surface, but the air was thick with something older than time: fear. In the center stood a writing desk upon which lay a stack of journals bound in green leather. These were Evangelene's final words, her testament to the horror she had uncovered. Her handwriting, once elegant, became increasingly erratic, reflecting a mind tormented by the weight of the truth and the terror of what it might cost. The journals detailed the inner workings of a conspiracy known as the Pittsburgh Circle, a group of industrialists, politicians, and lawmen who had banded together to control every aspect of the steel industry, not through innovation or competition, but through terror. Evangelene wrote of secret meetings held in the mansion's cellar, where men in tailored suits discussed murder with the same casual tone used to order cigars. She chronicled their plans, their methods, their targets. She documented names, dates, and transactions, all in the hope that one day someone would find it. One entry stood out. "They know. I saw the shadow outside my door last night. I have but days left, but I will finish this record. I will not be silenced." Evangelene knew her death was imminent, but she continued, driven by a force stronger than fear: justice. The chamber was not just a hiding place, it was a tomb, a time capsule designed to outlast her killers and outlive the lies. In the journals, she also described her husband's descent. Cornelius, once a man of ambition, had become a tyrant fueled by greed and paranoia. He saw enemies in every corner and silenced them all with ruthless precision. Evangelene's final days were marked by isolation, surveillance, and whispered threats that became screams in the night. And yet she wrote, she recorded, she resisted, because some truths demand to be told, no matter the cost. What else lies buried in the darkness of America's forgotten mansions? What secrets wait to be unearthed even now? Let's go deeper. There's more. Much more. The chamber's walls held more than words. They held the last relics of a woman betrayed by love and bound to a cause greater than herself. Beneath a dust-covered cloth lay the remains of Evangelene Vandermark, her bones curled near the desk where she had penned her final thoughts. The emerald silk of her gown clung in tatters to her skeletal form, a haunting echo of the night she vanished. But it was what lay clutched in her bony fingers that froze the workers in place: a locket. Inside, a faded photograph of her father, Harrison Hartwell, and an inscription: "To my beloved daughter, may you always fight for justice, no matter the cost." That cost had been her life. The examination of the chamber revealed scratch marks on the walls, desperate, ragged, and human. Evangelene had tried to escape. Her murderers had not simply killed her, they had entombed her alive, sealing the chamber with bricks and mortar, erasing her from the world. But they failed to erase the truth. Her journals contained evidence beyond imagination, financial records detailing bribes, sabotage, and the systematic elimination of rivals. Photographs taken in secret showed prominent men plotting by candlelight, their faces forever etched into the historical record, and recordings made on early phonograph cylinders captured voices, names, threats, confessions. Evangelene had used every tool at her disposal to ensure the conspiracy could not be hidden forever. She had turned her prison into a weapon, and now, decades later, her voice returned to indict the powerful. Federal agents, tipped off by the discovery, launched an investigation that would rock the foundations of American industry. But it was Edmund Hartwell, Evangelene's brother, long presumed dead, who emerged from exile to deliver the final blow. He confirmed everything. The night of her death, Edmund had received her last message, a coded telegram, warning him of betrayal, instructing him to hide, to survive, and to one day return. And now he had. His testimony was a dagger in the heart of the Pittsburgh Circle. But the deeper question remains: how many such circles existed? How many still operate in the shadows of wealth and power, protected by silence and time? This was not just one family's tragedy. It was a glimpse into a larger darkness, a system built on blood and secrets, and we're just beginning to uncover its depth. Edmund Hartwell, now living under the name Edward Harrison, stood before federal investigators, a man shaped by 30 years of shadows. His face bore the weight of exile, his voice marked by the grief of a brother who had lived with the knowledge that his sister had been sacrificed in silence. He spoke not just of Evangelene's murder, but of a machine, a system of control, manipulation, and execution hidden behind the gleam of industrial progress. The Pittsburgh Circle, he revealed, was not a myth whispered among laborers or the fever dream of radicals. It was real. Its members controlled steel, railroads, banks. Their hands directed the flow of money, law, and blood. Edmund described secret meetings held in mansions and private clubs, decisions made not by elected leaders, but by men who considered themselves above the law, men like Cornelius Vandermark. These weren't businessmen. They were architects of a new kind of empire, one not ruled by swords or flags, but by contracts, monopolies, and fear. Edmund detailed how the Circle had staged industrial accidents to kill rivals and labor organizers, then bought the silence of families with hush money or threats. They burned factories, poisoned wells, incited riots, all to maintain control and crush dissent. His sister had uncovered this, and for that, she was silenced. But not before hiding away their crimes. Edmund had preserved copies of her documents, kept in hidden caches across the Northeast. He now brought them forward, led investigators to safes beneath abandoned churches, vaults buried under forgotten properties once owned by their family. Each cache contained pieces of the puzzle, maps, letters, photographs. Together they painted a picture of systematic murder disguised as commerce, of a secret government behind the government. The investigators were stunned. This wasn't isolated corruption. This was a hidden history of America, an empire within an empire. And now as the files were opened, the names emerged. Senators, judges, industrialists, men who had shaped the nation's policies and fortunes, and their legacy was written in blood. But Edmund's revelations didn't end there. He believed the Circle never truly died. It adapted, transformed. Its descendants continued its work through new corporations, new alliances, hidden behind layers of legality and philanthropy. The Circle, he warned, had gone silent, not extinct. And as we examine this tale, we must ask, what else lies buried in forgotten walls, waiting to speak? The discovery in 1921 of Evangelene's sealed chamber beneath the Vandermark mansion was no coincidence. It was a breach in the fabric of forgotten history, a moment where time itself surrendered one of its darkest secrets. As workers dismantled the ornate oak paneling in the old library, they noticed something, a space that should not have existed. Measurements didn't align. Walls whispered inconsistencies. When they pried deeper, dust and decay gave way to revelation. Behind the wall, untouched by light for 34 years, lay a chamber of horrors and truth. Inside, time stood still. The air was thick with mildew and silence, but what they found would shatter the sanitized narratives of Pittsburgh's industrial rise. Shelves lined with carefully arranged documents, hundreds of files, photographs, letters, and in the corner, beneath the collapse of old shelving and moth-eaten fabric, the skeletal remains of a woman. A gown of emerald silk clung to the bones, and around the neck a locket, still intact. Within it a photo of Harrison Hartwell and an inscription, "To my beloved daughter Evangeline, may you always fight for justice no matter the cost. Father, 1882. This was no mere discovery. It was a reckoning. Investigators now faced the evidence of a murder long denied. The autopsy confirmed the truth Evangeline had written with her blood. A blow to the head, defensive wounds, signs of a desperate fight. And then, the most chilling detail, scratches on the walls. Evangeline had been sealed inside alive, entombed with the very evidence meant to expose her murderers. Her final act was not escape, but legacy. On the wooden floor, scratched with a piece of her jewelry, she had left a message. Just 6 words. Edmund. The Circle continues. Stop them. That message echoed louder than any courtroom testimony. Evangeline had known the price. She had gambled everything on the hope that someday someone would find this room and carry the torch of justice forward. And now, standing in that chamber, federal agents realized this was not just about one woman. It was about a network, a legacy of violence hidden beneath the Gilded Age of progress. And as they collected the evidence piece by piece, they began to see the shape of something monstrous, a conspiracy that had not died, but merely changed its face. The circle was not history. It was present, and it was watching. As word of the hidden chamber spread, federal authorities descended upon Pittsburgh under the pretense of structural inspections and historical interest. But what they were really after was far more volatile than crumbling walls. This was about silencing a past too dangerous to remain exposed. Agents moved quickly to secure the documents, photographs, and the remains of Evangelene Vandermark, but whispers escaped the cracks. Locals spoke of strange men in dark suits, unmarked vehicles, and construction crews that worked by night, removing crates from the mansion under heavy guard. The chamber's contents were transported under seal to Washington, yet before the evidence could see a courtroom, a quiet war ignited behind closed doors. Men whose names adorned the grandest buildings, bankers, steel magnates, senators, began to panic. The Pittsburgh Circle's legacy had not vanished with Cornelius Vandermark's death in 1903. It had metastasized. Their descendants now held court in boardrooms and congressional halls, and Evangelene's archive threatened to unravel it all. The investigation, initially publicized as a breakthrough, was suddenly cloaked in silence. Reporters who dared to pursue the story were redirected, their sources mysteriously unavailable. A few simply vanished. But the truth could not be buried again, not entirely. Within the chamber, investigators had found financial ledgers, coded communications, and detailed accounts of industrial sabotage and murder, and there among the files was a journal, Evangelene's final testimony. Written in trembling hand, its entries chronicled the months leading to her death, the deception, the surveillance, the realization that her marriage was a trap, a calculated move in a broader scheme of psychological control and institutional manipulation. Cornelius had never loved her. She was a pawn, her father's destruction merely a demon's illustration of the Circle's power. Her journal entry on December 12, 1887 recorded a chilling ultimatum. Cornelius had given her two options: disappear under a new identity and live in shameful exile, or die. Evangelene chose a third path: immortalize the truth, and in doing so she transformed from victim to catalyst. Her evidence implicated over 70 prominent individuals in systematic fraud, murder, and industrial espionage. But it was the documents marked future operations that shook federal agents the most. These weren't relics of a past conspiracy. They were blueprints for continued dominance, a guidebook for how the Circle's successors would manipulate markets, suppress dissent, and maintain control. Evangelene's death had not ended the Circle. It had merely delayed their evolution. And now, with the evidence unearthed, the clock had started again. The discovery of Evangelene's remains confirmed the worst fears of those still clinging to the myth of her disappearance, that she had never truly left the mansion alive. Her bones, wrapped in tattered remnants of an emerald gown, told a tale no one was ready to hear. The walls of that hidden chamber bore scratch marks, desperate and jagged, where her fingernails had clawed at the mortar. She had not died instantly. She had been buried alive, her own home turned into a tomb by the man who vowed to love her. The medical examiner's report noted trauma to the skull, defensive wounds on the forearms, and shallow gouges on the doorframe where she had tried to signal, futilely, for help. But it was the message carved into the wooden floor that silenced even the most hardened investigators. Using what was likely a piece of her jewelry, Evangelene had scratched the words, "Edmund, the Circle continues. Stop them. Justice for Father. Ev 1887. That inscription, written in her final moments, was a defiant act of willpower and clarity. It was her legacy, burned into the narrative of American history, one that no longer could be denied or hidden. Edmund, her brother, still lived. Under a new name in exile, he had watched the world forget his sister while the Circle flourished in shadow. Now, summoned by federal agents, Edmund returned to testify. He carried his own archive, copies of letters, maps, names. He spoke in solemn tones, his voice weathered by years of fear and isolation, about the conspiracy's reach into every level of American life. He confirmed the Circle's orchestration of economic panics, labor violence, even foreign policy. Their power was rooted not in brute force alone, but in psychological domination, in controlling what people believed, feared, and desired. Through media manipulation, strategic marriages, and manufactured crises, they had shaped not just markets beyond their minds. Evangelene had tried to expose this web, and for that she was silenced. Edmund revealed that even now the Circle's modern descendants controlled corporations, newspapers, and political machines. Her death was not an ending. It was a beginning. And as federal investigators listened in stunned silence, one truth became clear. This was not just the story of a murdered woman. It was the unraveling of a hidden order that had shaped the very fabric of the nation, and its exposure had only just begun. The federal investigation that followed was unlike anything the United States had ever seen. As Edmund's testimony was cross-referenced with the hundreds of documents recovered from Evangelene's hidden chamber, a horrifying pattern emerged, a pattern of industrial espionage, murder disguised as accident, and entire communities manipulated through fear and misinformation. Names began to surface, not only of long-dead conspirators but of living men, senators, bankers, media magnates, whose fortunes could be traced directly to the crimes committed in the shadows of the Gilded Age. The Pittsburgh Circle, as it came to be known publicly, was more than a cabal. It was a system. A system of control so deeply embedded in the machinery of American progress that to pull it out would be to risk the collapse of trust in institutions themselves. Newspapers hesitated to print the full extent of the revelations. Editors received anonymous threats. Investigators reported being followed, their families harassed. One federal judge, scheduled to preside over early hearings, died in a car accident deemed suspicious by his own clerks. The Circle, though weakened, was not yet dead, and still the documents continued to bleed secrets. Among them were detailed diagrams of steel mills where accidents had been planned weeks in advance to eliminate union leaders. There were letters between Cornelius Vandermark and foreign financiers, arranging deals that would destabilize American currency in favor of speculative profits. There were even internal memos proposing new technologies, not for industry but for surveillance, devices that could listen, record, and observe without detection. Evangelene had documented not just past crimes but the future strategies of psychological control. Her murder had delayed exposure, but the rot had only spread deeper in the intervening years. As public outrage grew, pressure mounted on the government to act, but many feared that a full reckoning would shatter public confidence in the very idea of progress. So compromises were made. Certain names were redacted. Certain files disappeared. A narrative was crafted that a small group of rogue industrialists had gone too far, that justice had been served, and that order was restored. But Edmund knew better. He watched from the sidelines as history was rewritten in real time. The true story, Evangelene's story, was buried beneath layers of half-truths and omissions, and he understood with bitter clarity that the Circle had not been destroyed. It had evolved, rebranded, hidden again, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. In 1923, the Vandermark mansion was demolished under the official pretense of structural instability, but those who had walked its shadowed halls knew the truth. The building was not crumbling from age, it was collapsing under the weight of secrets. Inside its walls, countless hidden compartments, narrow passageways, and sealed chambers had borne silent witness to conspiracies that shaped the fate of a nation. As wrecking balls struck the ancient stone, a crowd gathered to watch, unaware that they were witnessing the erasure of one of the darkest altars of American industry. The site was later converted into a modest park, a patch of green with a plaque honoring the victims of industrial violence. No mention of Evangelene Vandermark, no mention of the Circle, just a quiet, sanitized memorial erected to soothe the public's unease. But beneath the soil, fragments of history remained, scratches on the floor where Evangelene had clawed for escape, broken pottery she'd used in vain attempts to dig through brick and mortar, and the final message she'd etched into wood. Edmund, the Circle continues. Stop them. Justice for father. Ev, 1887. These words haunted Edmund as he wandered the park in the early morning light. Long after the crowds had dispersed and the headlines had faded, he carried her journal in his coat, close to his chest like a relic, and with every heartbeat he felt the weight of her sacrifice. He had survived, yes, but survival came with a price. He was not the man he had once been. Evangeline's death had carved a hollow into his soul that no amount of justice could ever fill. He had seen the machine behind the illusion, the cold gears of greed, manipulation, and control, and he knew that tearing it down would take more than evidence. It would take time, and it would take men willing to vanish into the dark to do what others feared. That night he penned a letter, not to law enforcement, not to the press, but to a small network of reformers, investigators, and former allies who had gone underground after the first wave of the scandal. The letter was short, direct, and heavy with meaning. The circle sleeps, but it dreams still. I have her words. I have the names. We begin again. That was the true legacy of Evangelene Vandermark, not just the exposure of a crime, but the ignition of a movement that would fight in the shadows for the soul of a nation already lost to its own illusions. By 1925, the federal investigations sparked by Evangeline's hidden archive had begun to fade from the headlines. The public, always hungry for scandal, had consumed the drama, the revelations, the names of the powerful fallen. But as time passed, the deeper implications were quietly buried. Men with influence rewrote the narrative. The Pittsburgh Circle was dismissed as an isolated anomaly, a relic of a more primitive era of industrial ambition. But Edmund Hartwell, still living under the name Edward Harrison, knew better. He had seen the maps, the ledgers, the correspondence. The circle was not dead. It had evolved, adapted, shedding skin like a serpent. Their wealth remained, their networks intact, their methods, psychological manipulation, control of information, economic sabotage, had simply become more refined. In a quiet room in Los Angeles, Edmund met with 4 others, men and women whose lives had also been shattered by the circle's reach. One was a former journalist whose partner had vanished in 1902 after exposing labor abuses in Pennsylvania. Another, a railroad executive's daughter who had uncovered her father's murder disguised as suicide. All of them had something in common. They had survived, and they wanted to fight. On the table between them lay the red leather journal, Evangeline's words preserved like a weapon. Her voice, tremulous yet resolute, filled the room as Edmund read aloud her final entry. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of her truth. He told me that I had served my purpose. Now I was a liability. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Edmund spoke, his voice cold, deliberate. We were born in the light of lies. Everything we've been taught, every institution we trusted, it was built by men like Cornelius Vandermark, men who believe in control, not freedom. They silenced Evangeline because she knew the truth, but she left you this to finish what she started. They began work that night, not to expose but to dismantle. Piece by piece, the surviving assets of the circle were tracked, their modern front companies identified. Shell corporations in New York, steel trusts in Chicago, law firms in Washington that once sheltered their ancestors' crimes. The battle would not be fought in courts or headlines, but in silence, in shadow, using the same weapons the circle once wielded. Evangeline had not just documented history, she had birthed a rebellion. And now, decades after her death, the war for truth was only beginning. The deeper they delved into the remnants of the Pittsburgh Circle, the clearer it became that their reach had infected not just industry, but the very systems of knowledge, belief, and perception. Schools taught a history scrubbed clean of their atrocities. Museums, funded by their descendants, celebrated the industrial pioneers without a whisper of blood or manipulation. Newspapers that had once hinted at the truth had their archives mysteriously missing key articles, pages ripped from history itself. The conspirators had not just controlled steel and oil, they had controlled memory. Edmund Hartwell knew that to destroy the circle, they had to go beyond exposing crimes. They had to break their legacy. One name kept appearing in the ledgers and letters: the Ashford Foundation, a charitable organization operating in the 1920s that claimed to fund public libraries and educational programs across the Northeast. In reality, it was a laundering front, taking money forged in the fires of sabotage and murder and converting it into influence, respectability, and obedience. The Ashford Foundation's records were locked inside a private archive in Boston, housed in a fortified building that had once been a Union Bank branch, the same bank that Cornelius Vandermark had secretly controlled. Gaining access would not be legal, but legality was a luxury Edmund and his allies no longer entertained. Under cover of darkness, with forged credentials and the precise timing born from months of surveillance, they entered the archive. Inside, they found floor after floor of steel filing cabinets, all meticulously labeled and organized. There were photographs of senators, judges, even presidents, men who had accepted money, favors, or threats. There were letters, diaries, and audio recordings, proof that the Circle's web had extended into every corner of power. But the most chilling discovery was a vault marked continuity. Inside were plans, not from the past, but for the future. Documents dated 1927, 1935 and beyond, outlining strategies for shaping public opinion, manipulating markets, and engineering social unrest when needed. One document in particular bore the heading Perception Management, Phase 2. It described using emerging radio networks to shape public emotion, to cultivate fear, rage, loyalty, not through truth, but through engineered narratives. They would control not just events, but how people felt about them. Edmund stood in the vault, holding the yellowed paper in trembling hands. Evangelene's final message echoed in his mind. The Circle continues. Stop them. This was no longer about justice. It was about survival, for the truth and for the future. What Edmund found next shook him to his core. Hidden beneath the perception management file, there was a slim ledger bound in cracked black leather. Unlike the other documents stamped with the insignia of the Ashford Foundation or the Vandermark Trust, this book bore no official seal. On its cover, scrawled in fading ink, were the words, Initiates and Executors. Inside, it listed names, hundreds of them, each one marked with symbols Edmund had never seen before. Triangles, circles, crosses inverted, and strange alchemical sigils that seemed to hum with sinister intent. These were not merely business partners or political pawns. These were members of something older, darker, an order that predated the Pittsburgh Circle. At the back of the ledger, he found a folded map of the eastern United States, marked with 7 locations, each one corresponding to a major industrial center: Pittsburgh, Boston, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and a place simply labeled The Seat. No state, no coordinates, just a blood-red X and the word Seat. Edmund understood then that Cornelius Vandermark had not been the architect. He had been a servant to something far more ancient, a continuity of power that used industry, finance, and violence as tools, but whose true goal was not wealth, but control of human will. As Edmund and his allies photographed every page, a silent alarm they had missed was triggered. Floodlights roared to life outside the archive, and the sound of armored vehicles filled the night. They had minutes, perhaps less, before the Circle's modern enforcers arrived. Fleeing into the underground tunnels that once served the bank's gold vaults, Edmund clutched the black ledger like a lifeline. The others carried boxes of documents, film reels, and a single phonograph cylinder labeled Evangelene, Final Testimony. The tunnels led them to an abandoned subway platform, long forgotten beneath Boston's cobblestone streets. There, in the darkness, Edmund played the cylinder on a portable device they had brought with them. Evangelene's voice crackled to life, haunting and resolute. If you're hearing this, it means I failed, but you have a chance to succeed. The Circle feeds on fear and silence. Break both and you break them. Her final words were chilling. Find the seat. End it there, or it never ends. As the sound faded, footsteps echoed down the tunnel. They were no longer just fugitives. They were now the bearers of forbidden knowledge, knowledge so dangerous it had killed before, and would kill again. The darkness of the tunnel seemed to close in around them as Evangelene's last words echoed through the cold air. Find the seat. End it there, or it never ends. Edmund's grip tightened on the ledger. His mind raced, not with fear, but with purpose. Whatever the seat was, wherever it lay, it was the heart of this ancient machine, and machines, no matter how vast or old, can be broken. As they pushed deeper into the tunnel, dim emergency lights flickered overhead, long forgotten, now blinking to life as if summoned by the very presence of the ledger. At the tunnel's end, they emerged into a disused rail yard on the outskirts of Boston. There, an old ally waited. A woman named Margaret Rowe, once a reporter silenced by the Circle, now a shadow operative in the Resistance. Margaret ushered them into a waiting truck. As it roared to life, Edmund looked back at the tunnel's mouth, now swarming with black-clad figures. Too late. They had escaped. For now. In the back of the truck, Margaret opened a small case and handed Edmund a document. It was a page torn from a 1782 land registry, a royal grant issued to one Elias Vandermark. The property? A mountainous tract of land in upstate New York known to local tribes as the Hollow Seat. The note in the margin was written in Evangelene's hand. Here begins the circle. Here it must end. That night, Edmund's group drove north into the fog-choked forests of the Adirondacks. Along the way, Margaret explained what she had uncovered. The Hollow Seat was not just a place. It was a convergence point where power, myth, and blood intersected. The native Mohawk had long feared it, calling it Tahawus, the place of the whispering stone, where the earth itself seemed to speak. Colonial records mentioned disappearances, strange lights and sounds beneath the mountain. During the Civil War, it became a Union arms depot, then quietly purchased by the Vandermarks in 1871, sealed off from public access ever since. As dawn broke over the dense forest, they arrived at the perimeter. Razor wire, guard towers, surveillance drones. The Circle was guarding something here, something they didn't want the world to see. Edmund stared at the mountain rising before him, shrouded in mist, ancient and silent. This was the seat, the place where Evangelene's crusade had led, the place where the oldest conspiracy in American history had buried its heart, and now it was time to dig it up. The morning air was thick with the scent of pine and the electric tension of revelation. From the ridge overlooking the Hollow Seat compound, Edmund studied the layout through field glasses. Watchtowers punctuated the tree line like sentinels of a forgotten war. Armed guards paced silently. There were no insignias, no flags, only blank uniforms and cold efficiency. These were not mercenaries. They were believers, sworn to the Circle's ancient code, guardians of its buried truth. Beneath the mountain, Evangelene had once written, was the archive, a vault not of gold but of knowledge, evidence, records, names. The seat was no mere hideout. It was the Circle's origin and its sanctuary. It had to fall. Edmund turned to Margaret and the others. Their eyes revealed the same thing he felt. Fear sharpened into purpose. Tonight, he said, his voice low and hard, we break the seat. But as they planned the infiltration, Margaret produced something else, an old map marked with strange geometric symbols, circles within circles, lines crossing through the Hollow Seat like veins. These markings, she said, they match the ley lines, energy paths known to the ancients long before the Circle ever came here. Edmund felt a chill crawl down his spine. The seat wasn't just the birthplace of corruption, it was built upon a site of primordial power. Evangelene had hinted at this in her final writings, that the Circle's manipulation of industry, politics, even war, was fueled by something older than man's greed. The seat was a taproot into something deeper, darker. That night they moved silently through the trees, bypassing sensors and patrols with a precision born of desperation. Reaching the mountain's base, they found the entrance, an iron door built into the rock face, sealed by a coded mechanism. Edmund retrieved the ledger, flipping to a page Evangelene had bookmarked. A sequence of new embers, coordinates, dates, equations, etched with trembling hands. He input the code. The door groaned open. Inside, a stone corridor sloped downward, lined with flickering electric torches, as if the mountain itself was alive. As they descended, Margaret whispered, "This place, It's older than the circle. They just inherited it. Edmund nodded grimly. Then tonight, we end the inheritance. Deeper they went, into the seat's core, where the air grew colder, heavier, and the walls pulsed with a strange, rhythmic vibration, like the mountain was breathing, waiting, watching. The final confrontation had begun. The corridor gave way to a vast chamber carved deep within the mountain, a cavern so immense that their lanterns could barely pierce its darkness. The walls shimmered faintly with mineral veins, but it was the floor that seized Edmund's breath, a mosaic of stone tiles arranged in symbols he recognized from Evangelene's sketches: circles, eyes, serpents devouring their own tails. In the center stood an altar, not of religious devotion, but of calculation. Upon it lay bound volumes, stacks of ledgers, and strange mechanical devices humming with arcane energy. The air itself vibrated, as if history had compressed into this singular moment. Margaret stepped forward, lifting one of the books. "This isn't just about money," she whispered, thumbing through its brittle pages. "These are experiments, psychological studies, control systems. They were mapping the human mind, its fears, its thresholds, its breaking points." Edmund's hands trembled as he opened another volume. Diagrams of factories, schools, even churches, mapped as systems of influence. Notes in the margins detailed how belief could be weaponized, how trauma could be engineered for control. "This is how they ruled," Edmund murmured, "not just with violence, but by shaping perception, generation after generation." A low rumble echoed through the chamber. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall, cloaked, face obscured. "You've come far, Hartwell," the man intoned, voice like gravel. "Your sister was brave, but misguided. She believed knowledge would free mankind. We know the truth. Control is mercy. Chaos is the alternative." Edmund stood firm, rage burning in his chest. "Control is a lie, built on blood." The figure stepped closer, revealing a mask of polished obsidian. "You think exposing us will end this? We are not bound to names or faces. We are principle. We are continuity. When this seat falls, another will rise." Margaret raised a torch, casting light across the chamber's ceiling, and gasped. Above them were frescoes, not of saints or kings, but of industrial empires rising from tombs, of cities built upon bones. The circle had long known its legacy. "Even if we fall," the masked man said, "the system endures. That is our genius." Edmund stepped to the altar, placing Evangelene's final journal atop the ledgers. "And this," he said, voice steeled, "is her vengeance." He struck the torch to the dry parchment. Flames roared upward, licking the ancient stone. "Let the truth burn its way into history." The chamber filled with light, and the mountain began to quake. The flames surged with unnatural force, leaping higher than any fire Edmund had seen. The air became thick with smoke and ash, as though the mountain itself was exhaling centuries of buried sins. The masked figure recoiled, shielding his eyes as the fire engulfed the altar. "Fool," he spat. "You've doomed us all." Edmund's voice cut through the chaos. "No, I've doomed your illusion of control." The ledgers crackled and disintegrated, releasing sparks like dying stars. Margaret pulled Edmund back as the chamber's floor began to split, stone groaning beneath the weight of its own revelations. The frescoes above fractured, raining dust and debris. Behind them the passage collapsed with a deafening roar, sealing off their escape. But Edmund knew they couldn't turn back. They had to press forward, deeper into the darkness where the final truth lay hidden. The masked figure vanished into smoke, his final words echoing like a curse. "The circle never ends. We are the architects of fate." They stumbled through a narrow tunnel, walls trembling around them. At its end they found a steel door, rusted but intact, marked by the same symbol from Evangelene's locket. Edmund pried it open with trembling hands, revealing a vault. Inside were shelves of documents, blueprints, and recordings, evidence that Evangelene had hidden in case her initial archive was destroyed. She had anticipated the circle's ruthlessness. She had planned for survival, even in death. Margaret found a phonograph device, its cylinder labeled December 11th, 1887. She wound it carefully, and a voice crackled to life. Evangelene's voice. "To whoever finds this, I pray it is Edmund. I know now that I cannot stop them alone, but the truth must not die with me. This vault holds the roots of the Circle's power, how they infiltrated banks, schools, even churches, how they rewrote history to justify their dominance. Burn it, you must. But let the world know. Edmund's eyes stung with tears, but he clenched his fists with resolve. She gave everything for this. We can't let it die here. They gathered the documents, knowing the Circle's agents were closing in. Outside, the mountain shook with renewed fury. Sirens wailed in the distance, law enforcement or perhaps something worse. As they emerged into the night, clutching the last fragments of Evangelene's legacy, Edmund realized they were no longer just witnesses to a dark history. They were now the final line between truth and oblivion. And the Circle would not go quietly. The wind howled across the Pennsylvania hills as Edmund and Margaret stumbled from the mountain's base, clutching the battered satchel filled with Evangelene's final archive. The ground beneath them still trembled with aftershocks from the fire and collapse inside the chamber, but there was no time to look back. Headlights appeared in the distance, black automobiles without license plates crawling along the narrow mountain road like predators scenting wounded prey. "They're here," Margaret said, her voice tight with fear. "We need to disappear. Now." Edmund nodded. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to bury this nightmare forever. But Evangelene's voice still echoed in his mind, her final plea seared into his soul. He couldn't run. Not now. They veered off the road, plunging into a dense forest, moving silently beneath ancient trees that had witnessed centuries of hidden atrocities. Edmund's thoughts churned. How deep did this conspiracy go? The documents hinted at more than industrial corruption. They pointed to secret experiments in psychological control, patterns of manipulation embedded in newspapers, schools, and even sermons. The Circle hadn't just ruled industry, they had molded thought itself. In a clearing deep in the woods, they found an old ranger's cabin, long abandoned but intact. Inside, by the flickering light of a lantern, Edmund spread out the documents. One blueprint in particular stopped his breath, a detailed plan for a mental conditioning program called the Harmony Initiative, developed in 1891. It described using subliminal messaging in public education, controlled fear through orchestrated disasters, and the use of pharmaceuticals to dull dissent. It wasn't just about profit, it was about power, absolute control over human will. They weren't just industrialists, Edmund whispered. They were engineers of the mind. Margaret's face palsied, and we've been living in their shadow ever since. Outside, the crunch of footsteps on frost-bitten leaves shattered the silence. Shadows moved between the trees, Circle operatives, closing in. Edmund looked at Margaret, then at the satchel. They couldn't let this evidence fall back into enemy hands. "You go," he said. "I'll hold them." But Margaret shook her head. "No, we finish this together, like Evangelene wanted." They sealed the documents in a watertight container, burying it beneath the cabin's stone floor. Then they fled into the night, leaving behind a map, a message, and the last hope that truth could still find the light. But deep in Edmund's mind, a chilling thought took root. If this was just one branch of the Circle's design, how many others still remained in the shadows, guiding our world without our knowledge? Days turned into weeks as Edmund and Margaret vanished into the web of America's forgotten places, abandoned mining towns, empty rail stations, and derelict river docks where no questions were asked. Their faces changed with each city, their names rewritten on forged documents. But the burden they carried, the knowledge of what the Pittsburgh Circle had done, could not be shed. Edmund, once a man of law, now walked among ghosts and shadows, driven by one purpose: to awaken the world to the truth his sister had died to reveal. Hidden in a tenement on the outskirts of Cleveland, they contacted a trusted friend from Edmund's past, Jonathan Hale, a former newspaper editor turned private archivist, known for exposing corruption but now living under threat for crossing the wrong men. Hale listened in grim silence as Edmund laid the documents before him, the ledgers of blood money, the plans for psychological manipulation, the identities of officials long thought untouchable. "This isn't just history," Hale murmured. "This is a blueprint for the world we live in, and they've already built it." He agreed to help distribute copies of the evidence to sympathetic reporters and a handful of surviving reformers. But time was not on their side. Reports reached them of sudden deaths, men connected to Evangelene's archive, found drowned, burned, or fallen from great heights. The circle, it seemed, was not extinct. It had merely evolved. Margaret discovered a code embedded in the financial records, unusual symbols and references to an entity called the Consortium, a secret continuation of the Circle's legacy. Unlike its predecessor, the Consortium operated through charitable foundations, think tanks, and global trade groups, hiding control behind benevolence. Its goal was no longer just industrial dominance, but societal engineering on a vast scale, and it had infiltrated everything. One me appeared repeatedly. Rothwell Industries, a corporation controlling everything from rail to media to pharmaceuticals. The CEO, Thomas Rothwell, was a descendant of a Circle founder. His company's logo, a serpent entwined around a torch, matched the seal found in Evangelene's hidden chamber. "It never ended," Edmund said. "The Circle just changed its name, its methods, but the goal is the same: control the mind, control the world." As they planned their next move, Hale warned them exposure would not be enough. They needed to awaken the public, to disrupt the narrative the Consortium had written for over a century, and to do that they would have to commit to a path from which there was no return, a war in the shadows against an enemy hidden in plain sight, whose power extended to every institution they once trusted. The first step in their war was to awaken the few who could still see, those whose lives had been scarred by unexplained losses, sudden bankruptcies, mysterious deaths branded as suicides or accidents. Edmund and Margaret crafted anonymous dossiers, each containing a fragment of Evangelene's archive, tailored to the recipient's personal history. A former railroad foreman whose workers had died in a boiler malfunction, a journalist whose exposé on steel corruption was censored days before print, a widow whose husband vanished after testifying against a bank merger. Each became a thread in a growing web of resistance. These weren't activists, they were survivors of the machine. And with the truth finally laid bare before them, they began to stir. Edmund knew this wasn't enough. Exposure had failed before. Names, dates, and blood meant little when power controlled perception. To truly ignite a reckoning, they needed something visceral, undeniable. Margaret uncovered a list of planned incidents from the Consortium's records: a staged factory explosion in New Jersey, a manipulated stock crash targeting small investors, a public health initiative designed to introduce psychological compliance techniques through pharmaceuticals. The timelines were precise. The deaths would appear accidental, the fallout beneficial to Rothwell Industries and its affiliates. The world wouldn't even know it had been altered. But if they could intercept just one of these events, reveal the mechanics behind the illusion, they could fracture the trust the Consortium relied upon. They chose the New Jersey factory, scheduled for destruction under the guise of industrial renewal. Inside were workers unaware their lives were currency. Edmund and Margaret moved under cover of darkness, contacting a sympathetic union leader who confirmed strange shipments and unexplained equipment failures. Time was running out. On the eve of the planned detonation, Margaret found the trigger mechanism, an old-style fuse wired through the building's ventilation, set to ignite under the guise of an electrical fault. She photographed everything, documenting the setup, the serial numbers, and, most damningly, the signature of a Rothwell contractor. As they prepared to exit, footsteps echoed through the factory's steel skeleton. Agents, faceless, efficient, merciless, closed in. Margaret slipped the evidence into a hidden wall panel while Edmund prepared for the inevitable. "We don't run," he said. "Not anymore." What followed was a confrontation born of desperation, steel pipes, fire, and the raw terror of hunted prey. They escaped, wounded but alive, and the factory stood unharmed. But now they had proof, and the enemy knew they had it. The Consortium's veil had been pierced. The war was no longer hidden. It had begun. The proof they carried was a time bomb, and they both knew it. As dawn broke over the New Jersey skyline, Edmund and Margaret found refuge in an abandoned church once gutted by fire, ironically another casualty of consortium restructuring decades prior. Beneath the cracked stained glass, they reviewed the photographs and documents Margaret had hidden during their escape. The evidence was beyond damning: signatures of Rothwell executives authorizing equipment sabotage, memos from affiliated law firms discussing legal indemnity in the event of accidental mass casualties, and photographs of the trigger device marked with proprietary identifiers. But perhaps most chilling was a handwritten letter from a Rothwell board member. The sacrifice of the few ensures the survival of the system. Collateral damage is the price of stability. That phrase, cold, calculated, became their mantra of defiance. They distributed the evidence to multiple trusted sources, including the union leader, now awakened to the scale of manipulation, and a small network of underground journalists known for their fearless reporting. One of them, a war veteran named Elijah Boone, had already lost family in a mysterious mining accident linked to Rothwell. When he saw the evidence, he didn't hesitate. His exposé, titled "The Blood Price of Empire," was printed and distributed across East Coast cities within days. The impact was immediate. Workers walked out in protest. The public began asking dangerous questions. And in Washington, a young senator, whose father had once been silenced by the consortium, called for a federal inquiry. But with the truth came retaliation. Within a week, Boone was found dead in his home, officially ruled a gas leak. The union leader vanished during a nighttime commute, and Margaret's safe house was raided, forcing them to relocate once again. The message was clear: exposure would not be tolerated. But it was too late to silence the storm. Copies of Boone's article had gone international, translated and archived by independent presses. The phrase, "collateral damage is the price of stability," became a rallying cry. Edmund and Margaret, now fully committed, turned to the final stage of their plan, activating the last safeguard Evangelene had created. The archive was only part of the legacy. Her true insurance was something more potent: a list of active consortium operatives codenamed the 13, individuals embedded in every level of governance and industry. And now, with the world watching, Edmund prepared to name them all. The reckoning was no longer coming. It was here. And for the first time in decades, the veil of control began to tear. But tearing down an empire of shadows is not as simple as exposing names. When Edmund released the list of the 13 to the press, alongside the remaining evidence from Evangelene's hidden chamber, the response was both electric and terrifying. Shockwaves rippled through every institution touched by the consortium's influence. On that list were revered philanthropists, captains of industry, former cabinet members, and media moguls, men who had shaped American policy, economy, and public perception for nearly half a century. At first, the public could not believe it. How could such respected figures be architects of industrial murder and manipulation? But as journalists dug deeper and leaked financial records, secret meeting logs, and internal memos, disbelief turned to rage. Mass protests erupted in cities across the country, calling for resignations, trials, and systemic reform. The Department of Justice, now under a reformist director, launched the largest anti-corruption investigation in U.S. history. But even as indictments were prepared, strange events began unfolding. 2 of the 13 died within days of the revelations, one in a car accident that left no witnesses, another from an alleged suicide despite no prior signs of distress. Others disappeared into private compounds guarded by hired security forces, and still the consortium's reach flexed. Key evidence went missing from federal archives, witnesses recanted under pressure, and media outlets, once fearless, suddenly shifted narratives, casting doubt on the entire investigation. It became clear to Edmund and Margaret that the consortium had not simply fallen. They had splintered, regrouped, and adapted. A hydra with severed heads, but still with claws sunk deep into the machinery of power. One night, in a safe house outside Baltimore, Margaret received a message, encrypted in the same cipher Evangelene had used. It was from a source inside the consortium, codenamed Zephyr. He claimed to be one of the 13, disillusioned by decades of complicity, now willing to testify and bring the rest down. But there was a price. Zephyr demanded full immunity and public disclosure of the consortium's foundational document, a manifesto called the Architect's Ledger, written in 1868 by the original founders, outlining their philosophy of control through engineered chaos. If released, Zephyr claimed, this ledger would shatter any remaining illusion of the consortium's legitimacy, proving that every war, every crisis, every economic collapse of the past century had been orchestrated. The stakes had never been higher. The war for truth was no longer just in documents and headlines. It was a battle for history itself, and whether it would be written by the victors or by those who dared to reveal the hidden hand. The Architect's Ledger. Just hearing those words sent a chill through Margaret's spine. She knew if it truly existed, and if its contents matched Zephyr's claims, it could be the key to unraveling the entire myth of American progress. It was said to be bound in blackened leather, written by hand in iron gall ink, and hidden in a private vault beneath the original Vandermark estate before its demolition. According to Zephyr, the ledger outlined a doctrine of perpetual crisis, a theory that stability was the enemy of profit, and that controlled instability, carefully timed economic and political disasters would keep the masses in fear and the elite in power. It detailed how false flags could be engineered to start wars, how bank runs could be triggered to collapse competitors, how epidemics could be weaponized not only to depopulate labor but to justify sweeping social control. Every page, he said, bore the names of those who signed their allegiance to this doctrine, men who would become presidents, tycoons, and judges. Margaret and Edmund didn't have time for doubt. Within hours of receiving Zephyr's message, they were on the road to Pittsburgh, following coordinates he provided to what remained of the Vandermark property, now a municipal park, its serene pathways concealing the ruins of a dynasty's dark heart. Under the cover of night, they found the entrance Zephyr described, an old iron grate hidden beneath an overgrown memorial stone. Breaking through decades of rust and decay, they descended into the cold belly of the earth, flashlights cutting through the darkness like blades. The air was heavy, the silence unnatural. At the bottom they found it, an old vault door, its surface marked with strange sigils Edmund recognized from Evangelene's journal as the emblem of the original Pittsburgh Circle. But as they approached, a sound echoed through the chamber. Footsteps. Not theirs. Armed men, voices low, approaching fast. Zephyr's betrayal was instantaneous. He had been a trap, bait to lure them to the Ledger's tomb so the consortium could erase the last witnesses of Evangelene's rebellion. But they weren't unprepared. Margaret triggered an explosive charge on the vault door, blasting it open just enough to retrieve the leather-bound ledger inside, its pages miraculously intact. As gunfire tore through the cavern, Edmund and Margaret fled, the ledger clutched tight, the truth now in their hands, but with it, the weight of a power that could change or destroy the world. They ran through the tunnels, blind in the dark, save for the dim light of their dying flashlights and the flare of gunfire behind them. Every breath burned, every step echoed with the knowledge that they were no longer seekers of truth. They were fugitives carrying a weapon more dangerous than any firearm. The Architect's Ledger was not just a relic. It was a manifesto of control, a step-by-step manual of how society had been bent to serve a shadow elite. It contained diagrams of factory layouts designed for lethal accidents, notes on psychological conditioning used in early schools to produce obedient laborers, and maps marking sites of planned civil unrest to justify martial law. Edmund clutched it tightly, its weight a burden he had waited decades to carry. Behind them, the tunnel exploded in light and sound. The consortium's agents were relentless, and as Margaret stumbled, Edmund turned back, his instinct to protect her overriding his fear. But she waved him on, her face bloodied, eyes burning with the same fire that once drove Evangeline. "Go! Get it out!" she shouted, raising a pistol. Her stand gave Edmund the seconds he needed to slip through a hidden passage she had found in the blueprints of the old mansion, the same passage Evangeline once used in her final moments. He emerged into the night, breathless, broken but alive, and in his hands the ledger that could shatter the illusion of America's innocence. Margaret was gone, But her sacrifice echoed Evangelene's. The women who had faced the circle and paid in blood. Edmund knew the ledger couldn't be hidden again. The truth must be spoken aloud, broadcast, printed, etched into the consciousness of a society lulled into complacency. The following morning, under a new identity once again, Edmund contacted the only journalist he trusted, a descendant of one of Evangelene's allies, a man with the same hunger for forbidden knowledge. He sent scanned pages from the ledger, names, dates, the blood price of industrial domination, and then he vanished. The news broke in fragments, first as rumor, then as scandal, then as a movement. But before it could gain real momentum, media outlets were silenced, servers erased, and key witnesses vanished. The consortium was not dead. It had evolved. But something had shifted. A crack in their facade. And from that crack, the voice of Evangelene, of Margaret, of the lost and betrayed, now echoed. Their fight was not over. It had only begun. As the weeks passed, the revelations triggered by the ledger ignited a tempest. What began as whispers in fringe newspapers soon erupted into a national crisis. The documents Edmund released exposed not only the Pittsburgh Circle, but its modern-day successors, hidden under new names, protected by new technologies, yet clinging to the same ancient methods of manipulation and control. Names of politicians, corporate executives, judges, and media magnates were laid bare. Their connections traced through shell companies, foundations, and secret societies stretching back to the 19th century. But something more terrifying emerged. Notes and schematics within the ledger detailing psychological experiments conducted in asylums, prisons, and even schools. Programs designed not to heal or educate, but to fracture identity, suppress dissent, and shape obedience. The term Pavlovian conditioning took on a sinister new context when the documents revealed it had been weaponized by industrialists decades before it became mainstream science. These were not coincidences. They were the calculated moves of an elite determined to mold society in their image, docile, fearful, and dependent. The public response was chaos. Protests flared across industrial cities, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and beyond. Symbols from Evangelene's final message, "The circle continues, stop them," began appearing on walls, on placards, in encrypted forums. The truth had awakened something primal, a defiance long buried under decades of comfort and control. But as expected, the backlash was swift and merciless. Blackouts struck communication hubs. Journalists who pursued the story were silenced, their deaths labeled accidents or suicides. Federal agents arrived under the guise of national security, seizing documents, arresting dissidents. The world had changed, but the methods remained the same, and amid this chaos, a broadcast signal emerged, pirated, untraceable. A voice, distorted but unmistakably human, began sharing pages from the ledger night after night. It was Edmund, or someone carrying his legacy. The voice recited names, told stories of forgotten victims, described how laws were written not to protect people but to protect power. And in the final moments of each broadcast, the voice spoke her name, Evangelene Vandermark. Her sacrifice, once buried beneath bricks and lies, now became the rallying cry for a new resistance. The circle had survived, but so had the truth. And in the hearts of thousands, Evangelene's fight was now theirs. Her story, once silenced, now burned like a torch in the night. But as the fire of resistance spread, so too did the grip of fear. Those who listened to the broadcasts began to vanish, not in masses but selectively. Journalists, historians, investigators who connected the dots too publicly, men in unmarked vehicles, operatives without badges or names, began appearing in industrial towns and remote regions alike. They didn't need to speak. Their presence was a message. The circle had adapted. Now it operated not just through boardrooms and courtrooms, but through surveillance, data manipulation, and psychological warfare. The tactics had evolved, but the goal remained unchanged: control of perception, and through perception, control of reality. Yet in the midst of this modern shadow war, a final piece of Evangelene's plan surfaced. It was hidden in plain sight, a cipher embedded in her last journal entry, the one found with her skeletal remains. Scholars, cryptographers, and curious minds had studied it for months, believing it merely a heartfelt plea. But beneath the surface of her words, Edmund, the circle continues. Stop them. Justice for father. Lay coordinates, dates, and a final location. A forgotten bank vault beneath a demolished building in Boston, the Hartwell family's ancestral home, and within it a second archive. Unlike the first, this collection wasn't merely evidence, it was instruction. Diagrams, blueprints, detailed methodologies for dismantling the psychological control systems the circle had embedded into society's very structure. Evangeline hadn't just exposed a conspiracy, she had mapped out its operating system. How fear was leveraged, how crises were manufactured, how obedience was programmed through repetition and spectacle. She had predicted the media machines, the financial crashes, the manufactured wars, and she had left behind a method for decoding them all. Those who accessed this final cache, known only as the V Protocol, understood its danger. It wasn't a call to arms, it was a call to awareness, a way to unmask manipulation, to reclaim autonomy of thought. But with knowledge came peril. Within days of the V Protocol's discovery, several of its custodians were found dead under mysterious circumstances. Yet the message had already spread, fragmented, encrypted, circulating in hidden corners of the internet, carried by whispers and symbols. Evangeline's legacy had become a virus within the machine. The circle could silence voices, but it couldn't silence awareness. And in that awareness, a new war had begun. Not for power, but for the sovereignty of the human mind. The past had bled into the present, and history was no longer safe. As fragments of the V Protocol echoed across hidden networks, something ancient stirred in the underbelly of modern power structures. The Pittsburgh Circle, once thought dismantled, had simply evolved, rebranded, redistributed, cloaked in legal entities and global alliances. Evangeline's death had not extinguished the Circle, it had forced it deeper into the marrow of institutions. But now, cracks appeared. Whistleblowers emerged. Mid-level executives, engineers, and former intelligence officers, men who had seen glimpses of the machine from within and could no longer bear its weight. Their testimonies matched the patterns Evangeline documented: coordinated economic collapses, strategic assassinations, and behavioral engineering through media saturation. These were not isolated evils. They were symptoms of a singular disease. Control, fed by fear and manufactured consent. In remote meeting halls and encrypted forums, a new order of resistance formed, disparate, fragmented, yet bound by a singular purpose, to finish what Evangeline started. They didn't march or protest, they infiltrated, decoded, and exposed. Their weapons were data, history, and awareness. But the Circle responded in kind. Blackouts, financial anomalies, mysterious disappearances. The media painted it as random unrest, but those who understood the code knew better. A new psychological battlefield had been opened. The minds of men were the terrain, and belief the most valuable currency. And then came the broadcast. A sudden transmission hijacking networks across continents. A voice, calm, commanding, anonymous, speaking words that had been buried since 1887. Evangeline was the first, but she will not be the last. The Circle is not broken. It merely sleeps, in boardrooms, in legislation, in your reflection. The message contained images, ancient symbols, blood signatures, industrial blueprints, and faces, polities, Shians, executives, generals, names that once seemed untouchable. The Circle had been named fully publicly for the first time in over a century. Panic spread through corridors of power. Some denied, some vanished. But the damage was done, the illusion was fractured, and still beneath this revelation a question loomed. Was the broadcast a weapon of resistance, or a trap laid by the Circle itself? A test to reveal those who would awaken? Evangeline's legacy had not ended with justice. It had become something more dangerous, a lens that allowed men to see. And once you see the machinery, you can never return to the illusion. You cannot unknow. You cannot unsee. You are now part of the story, In the weeks following the broadcast, strange events unfolded across the nation, events the media could not explain and would not name. Entire server farms mysteriously wiped clean. Stock markets halted by unexplained algorithmic feedback loops. Congressional hearings abruptly cancelled without cause. In the quiet corners of power, men whispered about Protocol Angelus, an internal failsafe allegedly designed by the Circle to activate when too many secrets surfaced. Its purpose was simple: reset control, disrupt the flow of information so thoroughly that truth and fiction would merge into indistinguishability. Amid this chaos, a battered briefcase appeared at the doorstep of a crumbling Chicago tenement. Inside, aged documents bearing Evangelene Vandermark's seal, her personal cipher intact. It was one of the missing caches, long thought lost or destroyed. Its contents were damning: blueprints of the original Vandermark mansion with annotations revealing secret construction orders, hidden rooms, surveillance systems, and, most disturbingly, a chamber beneath the chamber where her body had been found. A second layer of concealment. Hidden within that briefcase was a single photograph, grainy, black and white, yet unmistakable. It depicted Cornelius Vandermark, standing alongside a man who could not have been alive in 1887, a known financier from the 1920s, aged and hunched. Impossible unless there was continuity beyond bloodlines, continuity of identity, passed down, assumed, or somehow extended. Theories erupted: ritualistic transference, identity replication, or perhaps a hidden science never revealed to the public. But one thing was certain: the Circle did not merely endure, it evolved. Not just across generations, but possibly across lifespans, defying natural limits. And then came the message, delivered to a select few journalists and investigators, encoded with Evangelene's cipher. He walks still, his name changes, but the eyes remain. You know him by the silence that follows his presence. Find the Mirror House. The Mirror House, a term that sparked frantic searches. It referred to a long-abandoned estate on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, once owned by a steel magnate connected to the Circle. Rumors told of reflective walls, endless hallways, and a single chair at its center. Some believed it was a site of ritual. Others a control center for psychological experiments on the local population. But whatever its purpose, it had remained undisturbed. Until now. The Circle had left behind more than bodies and documents. It had left places, thresholds to something far more profound and terrifying than power, a place where truth itself was remade. The Mirror House, forgotten by maps, swallowed by overgrown forest, shielded by deeds registered to shell corporations long dissolved. But its presence lingered like a splinter in the skin of Pittsburgh's haunted landscape. It was Flanagan who first attempted to enter, following coordinates from Evangelene's last cache. By then an old man, half-blind and carrying the weight of secrets never spoken aloud, he approached the crumbling estate with a revolver in one hand and a recording device in the other. His journal, recovered years later, described the house as a living entity. Every surface inside was reflective, mirrors of varying clarity and distortion lining walls, ceilings, even floors. The effect was disorienting, creating a labyrinth of shattered reflections, infinite versions of the self watching from every angle. At the heart of the house he found a circular room, floor-to-ceiling mirror, a single iron chair bolted to the ground. A phonograph played endlessly on a loop, a woman's voice repeating a phrase in a language Flanagan did not understand, but which he transcribed phonetically before the recording was lost. Linguists later traced the phrase to a dead dialect of ancient Aramaic. Translated, it read, "From the eye command, from the mirror, dominion." What did it mean? Flanagan speculated it was a command ritual, something the Circle had used to condition members, perhaps to encode loyalty, erase memory, or worse, bend will. Nearby, he discovered cabinets filled with files, photographs of political figures, transcripts of meetings, medical records, each marked with symbols traced back to known Pittsburgh Circle operatives. Some photos bore dates from as recent as the 1970s, decades after the Circle's supposed exposure and dissolution, which meant the Circle had never ended. It had only gone underground, evolving, adapting, shedding names, but never its purpose. As Flanagan attempted to leave, his journal described the sound of footsteps echoing across the mirrored corridors, though no one appeared in the reflections but himself. He realized then that he was not meant to leave, that the house was not merely a place, but a trap, a living archive of power's darkest practices. His final note, scrawled in blood on the journal's last page, read, "They see through the mirrors. I see myself, but it's not me." Flanagan's body was never found. The Mirror House was sealed by federal agents weeks later and designated a hazardous site, but rumors persist that it still breathes, still watches, and that somewhere inside, the circle waits, not as men, but as shadows in the glass. They called it closure. The authorities who sealed the Mirror House, the historians who archived Evangelene's journals, and the journalists who declared the Pittsburgh Circle defeated. But those who looked closer, those who felt the presence of something unfinished, knew that the story had only retreated beneath the surface. A temporary silence. The evidence from the Mirror House was classified within weeks. Officially, it didn't exist. Federal agents, new faces with no prior records, took possession of every document, every recording, and vanished into the bureaucratic ether. Flanagan's journal was recovered by a maintenance worker months later in a drainage tunnel, half a mile from the mansion's ruins, the pages waterlogged but legible. His blood was still visible on the final page. It was the only piece that escaped. It described not just what Flanagan saw, but what he felt. A presence behind the mirrors, watching, judging, manipulating. A presence he believed was not just human. Evangelene's phrase echoed in his mind. From the eye, command, from the mirror, dominion. This was not metaphor. This was the operating code of control, the psychological machinery beneath civilization's surface. For the Pittsburgh Circle had not merely controlled industries, they had mastered perception, controlled what men saw, what they feared, what they desired, and in doing so they had shaped reality itself. Their legacy was not in ruined mansions or hidden ledgers. It was in the invisible systems still operating today. Surveillance, predictive algorithms, media designed not to inform but to pacify. These were not new inventions. They were modern tools wielded by old hands. The Circle had evolved, no longer needed steel mills or staged accidents. Their currency was data, their power secured not through assassination but psychological influence. Evangelene's sacrifice had exposed them, yes, but only temporarily. Like a serpent shedding skin, they had simply changed form. And so we are left with a question, a dangerous one. Do you truly believe the darkness ended in 1921? That the faces behind the mirrors stopped watching? Or do you feel even now that presence, shaping your choices, narrowing your thoughts, guiding you to conclusions you believe are your own? This story began with a missing woman and ended with a missing truth. Evangelene's final words were not a plea, they were a command. Edmund, the Circle continues, stop them. And now, it is we who must answer. Are we the watched or the awakened? Speak it in the comments now, twice. The mirror sees. The mirror sees. Let the watchers know. You see them too. But what became of Edmund Hartwell, the man who bore the weight of his sister's death and the burden of her legacy? After the Mirror House revelations, Edmund vanished once more. Not into exile this time, but into deliberate obscurity. Whispers surfaced across the Northeast of a man using a string of false identities, infiltrating the hidden networks of industry and finance. Some said he adopted the name Harrison Blake, others claimed he worked under the alias Nathaniel Crow. Regardless of name, his purpose was clear, to hunt the remnants of the Circle, not in Pittsburgh alone, but in every city where wealth and power converged. In 1933, during the height of the Great Depression, a series of unexplained financial collapses rocked the eastern seaboard. Newspapers blamed mismanagement, but buried deep in federal reports were references to targeted asset removals and disruptive internal disclosures. Officials close to the matter, long since dead, claimed that confidential memos bore a signature. E. H. Edmund was not simply hiding, he was dismantling. He had become a ghost within the machine, using his knowledge of the Circle's psychological warfare tactics to turn their own systems against them. He understood their true power wasn't violence, it was perception control. By disrupting the narratives they crafted, by exposing the illusions they relied upon, he created fractures. And through those fractures, he sowed instability, fear, and truth. In 1947, a declassified FBI report mentioned an anonymous informant who provided detailed intelligence on a shadowy financial syndicate operating in Chicago. The report ended with a single line: "Subject exhibits intimate knowledge of Pittsburgh case, probable connection to Hartwell investigation." But then, silence. Edmund disappeared again. No death certificate, no grave, no official trace. Some believe he was killed by the Circle, so's successors. Others believe he went deeper underground, training others, creating a lineage of resistors who would continue his work through the 20th century. But a theory persists among those who still follow the trail, that Edmund understood something fundamental, that the only way to destroy a system built on illusion is to become a myth within it. That his survival depended not on staying hidden, but on becoming a story, a ghost that haunts power, a symbol of resistance against unseen masters. And perhaps that's where you come in, not just to remember Edmund Hartwell, but to become him. The Circle never stopped, but maybe neither did Edmund, and maybe neither will you. So here we are, at the end of one story, but at the edge of another. The truth is, the Circle was never about Pittsburgh alone. It was never just Cornelius Vandermark or a mansion with secret rooms or even Evangelene's death. That was merely one chapter, one wound in the body of history. The Circle was a pattern, a system, a blueprint for how power hides in plain sight, mutating with time, shifting masks, evolving its methods, but always hungering for control. And now the question is, where is it now? In boardrooms, governments, digital empires, Evangelene believed that truth would outlast tyranny, even if it took decades. Edmund believed that knowledge, once revealed, becomes a weapon, a sword against corruption. And you've heard this story. That alone changes you. This isn't just a tale of 1887, it's a revelation about the present, about how history repeats through silence and fear. But you, watching this, are no longer silent. If you've felt the weight of this truth, if you understand the power it holds, then type the phrase, "The Circle breaks," twice in the comments. Let that echo through the digital halls they monitor. Let it mark you as someone who knows, someone they cannot ignore, someone who refuses to be a pawn in their game. The Circle breaks. Twice. Burn it into the algorithm. Burn it into your mind. And if you want to go deeper into the dark corridors of forbidden history, subscribe, hit the bell. Like this video so others see it before it disappears. Share it with those ready to wake up. Because the fight Evangelene began isn't over. It lives in every truth seeker, every man who chooses courage over comfort. Every soul that knows control must be challenged. I'll see you in the next tale. A darker, deeper journey into secrets they never wanted revealed. But for now, remember, the past is not dead. It lives in shadows, in silence, in stories whispered in the dark. Stay vigilant, stay awake, and never stop seeking the truth.